America exports more weapons than any other country.
It's not even close. The United States alone controls somewhere around 43% of the global arms market, and that's more than the next 7 countries combined.
In the last 5 years, U.S. arms shipments to Europe have more than tripled. And in May 2025, it made its largest defense deal ever with Saudi Arabia. But throughout history, U.S. weapons deals have sparked major scandals and even armed America's future enemies.
This is a sleazy policy, and it will always be attended by sleazy details.
So how did America build the world's biggest weapons business? And what are the potential consequences? America's weapons industry began with a scramble for gunpowder during its fight for independence. While battling the British in the Revolutionary War, the US was so short on firepower that France had to secretly smuggle in weapons, helping America win the war. That close call proved the US needed to produce more of its own weapons. The government began opening armories in the 1790s and contracted with private gun makers like Colt and Remington. Production grew even more during the Civil War, and by the late 1800s, the United States was shipping weapons around the world.
They moved up the value chain and began to sell finished products to other countries.
By World War II, America had the infrastructure set, and U.S. factories went into overdrive, supplying 2/3 of the Allied nations' equipment.
The U.S. was loaning that stuff to the British, and that in theory would be paid back at some time in the future.
The war left countries across Europe and Asia in ruins, but the U.S. was largely untouched.
The United States found itself in a uniquely powerful position, but also in a world with a lot of risks.
The Soviet Union quickly became Washington's biggest rival, arming allies from Eastern Europe to nations like India and Egypt. The U.S. responded by selling weapons to oil-rich anti-Soviet countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, instead of sending in troops.
The Vietnam War kind of showed the U.S. that the idea of direct intervention overseas to stop communism didn't work. Middle Eastern oil was an important element of U.S. Industrial capacity at that time. So keeping the Middle East from becoming communist was an important priority.
Iran got most of its weapons through deals with the U.S. government, which then paid billions to private companies to build them.
When you do a foreign military sales contract, it generally includes training, maintenance, a lot of support material, which a lot of countries like. But some countries don't want that. They want to do that all on their own.
Saudi Arabia struck deals directly with U.S. companies, approved by Washington, but monitored less closely than arms sales to Iran. From 1970 to 1974, U.S. weapons sales increased tenfold to over $10 billion a year.
It saw its network of alliances and partnerships as a critical strategic advantage.
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, countries like Poland and India turned to the United States for new weapons, helping it expand its dominance. Over the next several decades, Saudi Arabia became America's largest weapons buyer.
During the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, the Saudi Arabians were concerned that Iraq would continue and try to take territory from Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. was their security guarantor in the region.
Today, Saudi Arabia gets 74% of its weapons imports from the U.S., mostly through direct weapons sales.
I think that we can expect arms transfers to continue to flow to Saudi Arabia. President Trump, who has very clearly articulated the commercial imperatives that are on his mind when it comes to arms transfers, sees Saudi Arabia as just a very important marketplace.
US-funded defense systems are costly proof of America's commitment to Israel, proof too, some say, of both countries' priorities.
So the United States exports hundreds of billions of dollars of arms every year through various programs, including government-to-government sales, commercial sales, or military aid programs, like what the United States provides to Israel.
Since World War II, Israel has received over $228 billion of military aid from the U.S., more than double that of any other country. Unlike arms sales, this aid is mostly funded by American taxpayers.
Its defense partnership with the United States is spelled out in something called Memorandums of Understanding. It amounts to at least $3.3 billion in military aid every year through foreign military financing.
Under the Memorandum of Understanding, Israel is required to use most of the annual sum to buy American-made weapons. The U.S. kicks in an extra $500 million a year to support Israel's missile defense programs like the Iron Dome, which intercepts short-range rockets. This partnership stimulates the U.S. defense industry and gives it influence in a volatile region. But for the first time in 2 decades, the U.S. is now sending more weapons to Europe than to the Middle East.
Really nothing compared to the surge in U.S. arms transfers that occurred following Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Ukraine's weapons imports have soared 100-fold since 2020, with America supplying 45% of them.
So when the war first began, the United States contributed quite a bit in terms of drones. But over the course of the war, Ukraine actually stood up a very robust industrial base for drone production and has produced millions of them over the course of the last year. Lately, there's been a lot of discussion about air defense interceptors and artillery shells. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of the transfer of tanks.
Since February 2022, the U.S. has provided roughly $67 billion of military assistance to Ukraine.
But over the last several years, you've seen this take on new political dimensions and made it a much more divisive issue than it was in 2022 or even 2023.
Unlike aid to Israel, which is guaranteed for multiple years, Ukraine's support is approved on a case-by-case basis and depends heavily on existing weapons stockpiles. U.S. officials warn that draining those reserves could undermine U.S. readiness for future conflicts.
The United States itself and many other countries have looked at the war and said, we might not be prepared for this kind of fighting ourselves. I don't think the United States is going to be able to maintain the same level of support that it was providing early on in the war. And so Ukraine is going to have to think about what does a sustainable defense relationship with the United States look like. And it may mean more in terms of arms sales rather than military aid. It may mean leaning more on Europeans or developing their own capabilities.
European NATO countries are scrambling to rebuild their stockpiles, with combined arms imports almost doubling over the past 5 years. Poland's have increased by 508%.
The invasion of Ukraine really reshaped its conception of its own security. And so it's undergone this massive defense modernization effort. There are around $20 billion worth of active government-to-government contracts with Poland, which represents a substantial growth.
The U.S. is taking a page from its 1970s playbook with Iran, arming a trusted ally, this time Poland, instead of sending large numbers of American troops to the front line. Today, it supplies Poland with 45% of its weapons imports.
Poland is one of the biggest recipients of U.S. arms in Europe at the moment, which comes through a mix of arms sales that it's buying with its own national funds, but there's also been a slight growth in the amount of military aid that the United States provides to Poland, which is essentially grants from the taxpayer for Poland to buy U.S. weaponry. This includes things like attack helicopters, main battle tanks, fighter aircraft, all of which are very advanced and, as it happens, very expensive.
Just ahead of Poland, the UK is Europe's second largest arms importer, and it's even more dependent on the US.
Since the Second World War, the United Kingdom has probably been the United States' closest ally in Europe or beyond.
After World War II, the US slashed its defense spending. The policymakers were under pressure to avoid giving costly weapons away for free. So, in 1963, the US sold Britain nuclear missile systems, the first time Washington shared such advanced weapons with an ally.
For in obtaining an agreement for the United Kingdom to acquire what is called the Polaris missile, which will be put into a British-built submarine, we get this great advantage.
And so that has given rise to a very close defense partnership where really nothing is thought of as being entirely off limits. It's been a little bit of everything, high-end systems, F-35s, and cooperation on various defense fronts. NATO countries have a smaller review window where Congress is meant to scrutinize arms transfers, 15 days as opposed to 30 days.
The UK has also developed weapons with the US, contributing over $2 billion to the F-35 Lightning II program. Other US allies have made major investments in the aircraft too, not just as developers, but as key buyers. Norway is one of them, and 91% of its weapons imports now come from the US.
The United States has a very long defense relationship with Norway that's only kind of grown over the last several decades. The United States has partnered with Norway in military operations, including in Afghanistan, and sees Norway as a very trusted partner. Norway is thought of as being very important in its position, one, just geographically speaking, its location in the North Sea, especially given Russia's activity in that area over the last several years. They've been shown to be a fairly competent military force, and so supporting Norway has been seen as a key way of ensuring an appropriate force posture for NATO and the West in that very sensitive region.
But today, NATO countries face a second risk. US military support doesn't seem guaranteed anymore.
It strikes me that we are hitting a really unique moment in Europe. For most of the last 70-some years, there has been an assumption that the United States was going to be the security guarantor for Europe. And over the last several months, whether it's been statements or behaviors by the United States, have upended a lot of those assumptions.
Under US pressure, NATO countries agreed in June 2025 to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035.
I am not worried about US defense industry per se and the profit margins there. I think strategically there are probably more concerns to be had about the degree to which the United States feels able to influence and shape security realities at the same time that it is alienating allies and partners.
One of the reasons the US is pushing for more production from Europe? Increased concerns about China. After Saudi Arabia, Japan is the biggest importer of US arms in Asia. It fought the United States in World War II, and in 1947 adopted a new constitution that renounced war, giving up the right to wage it abroad. Then in 1960, it made a deal with the US. If it was ever attacked, America would come to its defense.
And both share a concern about China's role in the Indo-Pacific. Over the last several decades, the defense relationship has gotten closer. The amount of exchange has gotten closer, and I think that's been an important part of U.S. strategy.
Japan has doubled its weapons imports in the last 5 years, with 97% of them coming from the U.S. It also boosted its military spending by 21% in 2024, the biggest increase since the 1950s.
There is plenty that Japan does for itself, and Japan, of course, is one of the largest defense spenders in the world for its national self-defense forces. Japan's biggest contribution coming the other direction is access to basing in Japan.
That's also the case with South Korea.
So the United States has been a key security partner for South Korea since the Korean War, and of course maintains 28,000 troops on the peninsula, maintaining a front line with respect to North Korea, and also an additional front with respect to China.
Amid rising tensions, South Korea has ramped up domestic weapons production, now making 76% of its own arms. It also became one of the world's top 10 arms exporters.
South Korea, as an example, has developed a very impressive defense industrial base and an export market, but not in a way that competes strategically with the United States, and in some ways might be complementary. Look no further than Ukraine, when South Korea was able to augment U.S. supplies of artillery shells that could then be transferred to Ukraine at a time when both countries were facing shell hunger.
South Korea has also sold billions of dollars of weapons to Poland in 2025, but it still relies on the U.S. for 86% of its weapons imports.
The Koreans are recipients of things like air defense and certain armored capabilities.
While South Korea's imports decrease, another country in Asia is emerging as one of the U.S.'s biggest weapons buyers, India. Before 2008, India's arms purchases from the US totaled about $233 million, mostly in helicopters and radar systems. Since then, they've surged to more than $20 billion.
This is a space where the United States sees an opportunity to take up market share from Russia.
And it's working. Before 2010, about 3/4 of India's weapons came from Russia, its strategic partner since the Cold War. Now it gets the majority of them from Western partners, including 10% from the United States.
I think what's been driving this has been the mutual concerns about China.
Tensions between India and China have escalated in recent years, largely due to ongoing territorial disputes. At the same time, China has become the main supplier of weapons to Pakistan, India's other main adversary.
I mean, it remains to be seen what the current crisis with Pakistan and India means for U.S. defense cooperation. At the same time, the United States seems to have played a role in shepherding a, at least temporary, ceasefire. India doesn't want to feel beholden to the United States and is very happy to accept arms transfers, but I think has a distinct interest and desire to be geopolitically independent.
India has remained neutral during the war in Ukraine and resists formal alliances with NATO. Still, it continues to buy more US arms than ever before, including its most cutting-edge aircraft, drones, and defense systems.
But of course, it's not risk-free, especially when there isn't necessarily always direct strategic alignment between Delhi and Washington.
It's a familiar risk. The US has a history of arms deals that backfire. Many examples stem from the Cold War, when the US poured billions into arming countries that opposed the Soviets.
Whether there's been a dramatic change in governance, whether there's been some illicit trafficking, the risks that are posed by these weapons are enduring and long-term.
In the 1980s, the US sold missiles and explosives to anti-Soviet Afghan fighters. Some of those weapons later ended up in the hands of the Taliban. During the same decade, the United States secretly sold weapons to Iran, hoping the country would secure the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. The US then used the profits from those sales to fund an anti-communist rebel group in Nicaragua, known as the Contras.
This is a sleazy policy, and it will always be attended by sleazy details.
The operation, later known as the Iran-Contra scandal, broke US law by sidestepping a ban from Congress, setting off a political scandal that led to criminal charges against top officials.
And you've admitted that you lied to the Congress, is that correct?
I have.
Can you assure this committee that you are not here now lying to protect your commander-in-chief?
I am not lying to protect anybody, Counsel.
Around that time, the US also sent chemicals to Iraq, even as Saddam Hussein used biological weapons against both Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians. In 2013, the US signed the UN Arms Trade Treaty, aimed at stopping weapons from fueling violence across the globe. Today, more than 116 countries have ratified the treaty, legally binding them to block arms sales likely to fuel human rights abuses, terrorism, or violence by rogue groups. But the US never ratified it through Congress, and in April 2019, President Donald Trump announced the US would withdraw from the treaty entirely. Meanwhile, US arms deals continue to spark backlash, including its weapons sales to Saudi Arabia.
The largest testing ground for how they would use these systems was Yemen. And the multi-year campaign it fought there against the Houthis. What we saw was not especially effective and involved a lot of civilian casualties. The international community saw the U.S. role in exacerbating this conflict, and it really undermined the U.S. position with respect to the Middle East and other allies and partners.
U.S. arms transfers to Israel are facing increased scrutiny too.
Throughout the course of Israel's war in Gaza, there have been a lot of concerns about the U.S. provision of weapons that are directly contributing to civilian harm, not just in the public domain, but also within the U.S. government, and has resulted in some dissent, some frustration, a couple of resignations.
The U.S. has also supplied Ukraine with weapons that pose risks to civilians, including cluster bombs and landmines.
They leave a number of unexploded ordnance in the places where they're used. And so that may cause a persistent and enduring threat to people living in those areas, to civilians, long after the war is over.
The U.S. remains the world's top arms exporter, but its role is growing more complicated. With advances in weapons technology, such as autonomous drones and hypersonic missiles, the stakes are rising fast. In 2025, the Trump administration accelerated arms transfers and rolled back Biden-era human rights checks. At the same time, Trump's tariffs have also put new strain on U.S. defense ties, prompting some key partners like India to reconsider weapons deals. U.S. systems like the F-35 could become more expensive and harder to build, since the jet relies on about 1,900 suppliers worldwide. With new buyers emerging, the U.S. faces competing priorities: maintaining global influence, sustaining its defense sector, and protecting civilians. The question now is whether it can keep that balance and avoid repeating past mistakes.